Oh, and it's recording, I think. Oh, and we have attendees. Gail, we're live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Let's get it. My executive producer, can you give me a roll call here? I want to make sure I have and include all of our illustrious guests before I get started. Who do we have here?
Right now, we just have Senator Irwin and Jelani McGadney.
Just? Man, we have an awesome.
Well, so we're missing people. Sorry. We could go on with just the two of them, but there's like 5 people missing.
No, to the topic, I just, want to appreciate everyone as best we can. This is the interim, but we're going to get some more people calling in. We'll do an official start like in a minute. We can just give a chat. Jelani, how you doing? My name's Alex Thomas. I'm a West Willow community advocate out in Ypsi Township, and just a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you. Good to meet you. How's quarantine for you?
Quarantine, I'm blessed. I'm among the privileged that, I don't have to be out. I'm a caretaker for my mom, and I've been able to, stay in and stay safe, but just trying to do what I can online like everyone else and try to help out the people that are out there. So we got a lot of good things going on here in Ypsilanti Township on the community advocacy side. How about yourself?
Honestly, I'm fine. I read, I sleep, I work. So, I'm trying to just stay calm and wait for when we can actually go back out in public and start trying to get back to normal life. So,
yes. Annie, do we have some more of our panel joining us yet?
So no one else has joined, but we have 70 attendees.
Okay. Hey, Senator Irwin, it's nice to see a familiar face. I've been really, just as a Michigan resident, I've just been so thankful with the leadership of our governor through this time, and knowing that, especially with the topic today, with the pushback and just how difficult it has been for her, I'm so thankful to have people like you and a lot of people that are going to be on this call backing her up and supporting her. So thank you. It's nice to see, some of her supporters, see you, a local face. I'm sure a lot of people that are in on the call are comforted to see you. So I'm going to let you say hello. Welcome.
Thanks for welcoming. It's great to see you, Alex. And, you're right. At a time like this, when the state's in crisis and the world's really, facing a crisis, you have these stay-home orders kind of rippling across the country and rippling across all these other countries. I think that certainly I would join you in saying I'm thankful for the leadership that the governor has provided. There's certainly, ways that, we could suggest this be a little different or that be a little different. We wish you could do this or why this and not that. And, certainly I want folks to know that I'm raising those sorts of, concerns myself to her team. But in the main, I think that she's done a good job of keeping the state safe. And I like the way that she's talked about trying to do a safe and rollout of an opening up, which is something I think we have to face. And so, thanks for having me on. I always appreciate seeing you in person. And I think maybe this is the first time we've done a Zoom call. So good to see you on.
Yeah,
here.
it's fun. Meeting you and help you've given me early on in this community advocacy thing. It really was motivational. I just really appreciate the support. Any more panelists join us? Annie, I want to get in.
Yes, Congresswoman Dingell just arrived.
Oh, well, that's great. I am especially excited, and I made those comments about the governor earlier. Equally excited and happy to have Congresswoman Dingell representing us. I'm going to turn the floor over and welcome Congresswoman Dingell.
How are you? It's good to be with you.
Oh, pleasure to have you. I know that you weren't at the protest, or at least that's my understanding, and I just I want to give you the floor and just let you share with everyone on the call just what you want to say about the protest or what you're feeling today. Give us an outlook of what's going on, and then we'll get to the other panelists.
You know, no, I wasn't there because I'm listening to the governor and I'm following the stay-at-home order. It's been 49 days. I've left my house once to go to Washington to vote on the bill last week. And I want to say, first and foremost, I understand as much as anybody does hating to stay at home. Now, one of you that's watching me would have put a penny that I could stay at home a day. But this virus is real. And the governor has based the decisions she's made on scientific facts and data. But, you know, I think we're entering into some very challenging times. We're in challenging times. I mean, what we're looking at, the disproportionate impact of this disease on the African American community, we weren't prepared for it. It's not going to go away until we find a vaccine. How do we make sure that not only can everybody in America get vaccinated, but everybody in the world get vaccinated? Our lives are going to change. I mean, physical distancing is going to be part of our lives. We're not going to handshake. We're going to have to change the way that we acknowledge each other and that we love each other. But, you know, freedom of speech and freedom to protest are very basic rights in our Constitution. But so is the common good. And what right does someone have to endanger another life by carrying a gun in a gallery, not following scientists and doctors' orders of keeping physical distance, wearing a mask, spitting on people, let alone the signage that we saw that is contributing to fear and hatred? And quite frankly, right now, the state that people are in, it would take a spark to just get something started. So what happened last week deeply bothers me, but we're going to have to really have a lot of very difficult ethical discussions about what is a person's individual rights and what is a community. How do you protect a community? And one of the other issues we're going to have to start to talk about is privacy. I'm a privacy nut. I think young people have no idea how much information they're giving away and sharing with people. And I don't think many things are people's business. But if someone becomes ill in a workplace, what is those that he's or she works with rights to know if somebody is contagious? How are we going to make safe workplaces? We're now going to start having ourselves, we're going to have our temperatures tested every place that we go. We're going to, you know, you're seeing people wear bands. They're developing apps. They're going to know who you've come in contact with, which has good things. So if someone gets COVID, they know who they've been near. If someone comes within 6 feet, you're starting to hear bells go off. But is it anybody's business where everybody's been? How's that data going to be used? After 9/11, we gave up a lot of privacy and a lot of liberties that we need to look at. And now we're going to take another step. So I have a lot of, I don't sleep at night thinking about all these issues because I think they're very, very complicated. And what is individuals' rights and what is the public good?
I'm so glad you brought up post 9/11, and that it was such it was an issue of national security. But under that veil, we did erode a lot of different rights, and it was we had a good faith belief that our law enforcement wouldn't overreach, and I think you just highlighted some serious issues that we got to look at in this health crisis. As far as contact tracing, privacy. That we don't want to make the same mistakes again.
Correct.
So thank you. We have a few panelists that were there at the Capitol, and I really want to give each, and I'm going to start with Senator Irwin, if you could give us in like 2 or 3 minutes just what happened that day and your experience and your thoughts on it, and then we'll continue with the next guest.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. And I'm certainly eager to hear from both my colleagues that were members of the House and from Jelani McGadney, who is on here, who is sort of the, I don't know what his, I'm afraid I don't know what his technical title is, but I would describe him as the floor marshal for the House Democrats, kind of the lead staffer who is telling people where to be and when to vote, and hey, sit down and this is what's happening next. And so I think he was certainly more in the room where it happened than I was, because the action that I think got most of the attention in the media and nationally was happening there in the House and really right outside of the House chambers. From my perspective, what happened was, we got called into session last week. We got called into session all 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And, leading up to Thursday, we really hadn't taken any action. The expectation was that the Republicans who lead the legislature were trying to decide what to do with the governor's request that they extend the declaration of emergency. Without getting too far down the rabbit hole, there's two different acts that the legislature passed, one in 1945 and one in 1976, that authorized the governor to take action during a crisis like this. And the 1976 Act has a clause in it that says that after 28 days, the governor is supposed to come back and ask the legislature for an extension for the powers that exist under that act. Those rules aren't in the 1945 Act, but anyway, that's what we were doing. That's why we were in Lansing, was to deal with the request of the governor. And there were many Republicans who wanted to reject the governor's request. They're very frustrated that the governor is exercising the powers that she's exercising. One of the things that's very frustrating to me, though, is that many of the things that they've asked for and that they seem to be most passionate about reopening, like golf and motorboating and garden stores, those things have already been reopened. So it wasn't clear what they were asking for, except for to take power away from the governor. And in the Senate, we did have some armed protesters enter the Senate gallery. But most of the scuffle that really gathered the attention of the media happened outside the House chambers. I'm going to give a description of that to my colleagues in the House, because I think, like I said, they were in the room where it happened. But what I will say is that, what was really disturbing to me at this protest, was the racist and sexist imagery that you saw. Really attacking the governor with imagery, comparing her to Hitler it's gross, and it doesn't contribute to the debate. And, it really, made our state look bad around the world. The sad part is, though, that, I think that what those protesters showed at the Capitol is a true reflection of part of Michigan. It may be a small part, it may be a minority, but it's a part that we have to know about, and it's a part that we have to honestly deal with. There are racist, white supremacist elements here in Michigan, and some of those folks were the folks who felt it was important for them to show up at the Capitol at this time and make themselves known. Before I pass on, because I see that now some of the other panelists who are there in the House have arrived, before I pass along, I do want to say that in connection to some of that white supremacist imagery, before the protest on Thursday, some of you may remember that last Friday, there was an incident in the state Senate where Senator Dale Zorn, who represents Monroe County and Lenawee County, so Monroe and Adrian, the communities around there just south to us, he represents the southern part of Milan, the community of Milan. He was in the Senate chambers wearing a face mask that had a Confederate logo on it. And I was sitting fairly close to the front of the room, and I thought I saw that looked like it was a Confederate logo on his mask. I approached a lot of my colleagues to try to ask if they saw what I thought I saw, because it was surprising that someone would do something so so discrediting, so embarrassing to the state of Michigan. As an elected official, it's one thing when you have a couple of protesters coming out and trying to get attention in outrageous ways and showing off their white supremacist views. That's surprising on one level, but it's surprising on a whole nother level when an elected leader, someone who's 1 out of 38 state senators of the state of Michigan, thought it was appropriate to wear a logo that to me it's a protest. It's a protest against our nation. It's a protest against the Union. It's a protest against, what we won in the Civil War, which was an end to slavery. It's a protest against the Civil Rights Movement. And when, Republicans and conservatives take such umbrage when people will burn a flag, maybe because they're, protesting a war or something like that. To me, this was almost like Senator Zorn was protesting our flag, but he was protesting it because of the progress that we've made on civil rights.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And that was one individual to think that represent a representative in the chamber that's bringing that to feel so comfortable. And it's hard to put a measure on how many people that does represent. But as an African American in Michigan, I familiar with those symbols, and I've seen much too much of it over my lifetime. And I'm not as shocked as some, but I'm definitely extremely disappointed.
I was shocked enough to alert the members of the media that were there and to ask them to ask Senator Zorn what was going on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that and reading about it. And thank you. Jelani, sir, if you could introduce yourself and let us know exactly what you were doing at the that day when they did enter when the protesters entered.
All right. So my name is Jelani, and I am although I would love my title to be the floor marshal, as Senator Irwin said, I am the floor operations manager. And a big part of my job is to try to organize the Democratic side of the House to make sure that they know what they're voting on. They have the information that they need, organizing speeches, organizing how the amendments are going to be coming up, and generally trying to make sure that members are in a place to make the decisions that need to be made for the state of Michigan. I work for the Democratic floor leader, Yousef Rabhi, and between the two of us, we're bouncing back from opposite ends of the floor, trying to make sure that that there's a cohesive message coming out. My duties on that day on the floor, I got to the Capitol a little bit early, not too early because, the longer I'm in a building, the longer I'm exposed. But immediately as I was driving into the parking garage, as I'm getting into Lansing, getting in the parking garage, I see a Confederate flag, I see cars out. I'm coming into the Capitol with my briefcase. I'm coming in with other things to prep session for the day. So immediately the tension was already raised. And that was before I even started to getting into the most important parts of my job. By the time I had gotten on the floor the second time, because we got into session, went at ease, and then we came back, I could not enter through the main house doors because there were so many protesters outside, because they were making such noise, and because frankly it was so frightening that I had to find another entrance onto the floor. Part of my job throughout all of that day was, with all the chaos that's going on, because the floor is already sort of chaotic anyway. There are 110 members, you've got clerks, you've got staff, and my job was to sort of navigate that chaos and try to find some order. And while that's going on, you hear booming at the door, and you hear the yelling and the screaming of, let us in. And my job was try to focus us to make sure that we could still do the business that the people sent the representatives to do.
I'm sorry, Jelani, if I can interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
You said, quite frightening. Was it frightening because of the number and the presence and what they represented, or did you feel physical danger, or did you feel like a physical threat for other members, or just the potential of violence? If you could, just the frightening part, if you could.
It was all of the above, but because of what I do on a day-to-day basis, I only had so much space for that. Because on the one hand, you've got the protesters outside. On the other, I'm trying to figure out where's the back entrance so that members who are in the gallery can come down, up and down, without having to deal with protesters. I'm trying to figure out what speeches are going on, so who's speaking at any given time. And so for me, there was only so much space that I could have for it. But what I could see from the members, and myself incled, but particularly the members, because I'm sort of observing them, was a genuine fear and concern, both for themselves and for the staff that were on the floor. Because there were moments that were a bit dicey. We weren't sure if they were going to be able to bust through the doors. And, on the House side, we're lucky that the gallery they weren't letting the public into the gallery, but that it didn't always feel the most secure. So
Well, thank you, Jelani. I want to make sure I get make sure we get all the panelists
please.
in, especially everyone that was there. I want to go to Representative Rabhi. Rabhi, are you there? Yousef?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear. Pleasure to have
Excellent.
you. If you could share with us just your thoughts and what happened that day and anything you want. It's your floor.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity for putting this together. One of the things I think that's really important to note here is what we saw was an act of political terrorism in many ways. The reason I say that is because you don't walk into a building, a place of government where we are trying to conduct the business of the people. You don't walk in there with assault rifles, with tactical gear. These people had bulletproof vests on. They had combat boots and a number of other things. At one point, as I was walking to the floor before the main loudest part of the protest was happening, I saw a single file row of these guys with their guns, and the leader of the troop said, basically like, "Are you ready?" And the other guys were like, "Yeah, let's go." And they literally looked like they were marching up the steps, like paramilitary style. That's what it felt like to me, to get up to that area where all the rest of the crowd had gathered. And I went up the back way to get onto the floor. And, in line with everything that Jelani described, once you get out there onto the floor, the walls, the doors were shaking. There's these double doors that swing open and closed. And it felt like they were right at the doors. You couldn't see outside because of frosted glass, but it felt like they were right at the doors. The yelling was very present and threatening. And it was an extremely scary experience. I think many of you on the call have probably already heard, descriptions and recounts of sort of what happened. But I thought one of the things I'd do too is kind of share, after a few days of being able to reflect on the experience, kind of, part of why I think it was so impactful in a negative way for me. And part of that is, frankly, going back to my family history just for a second, which my father is North African from Algeria. It is a country that, after its War of Independence, saw a period of about 20 years, which was civil war, essentially between an armed militia of religious fundamentalists that were trying to take over the government and, that were killing people indiscriminately. Civilians were getting caught in the crossfires. I had, relatives of mine who were injured and killed in that civil war. And my aunt, my cousins, moved to this country in the in the late 90s to escape some of that violence. And so while I never experienced it, I heard the stories of, firsthand survivors who were, in positions of, political and physical and, vulnerability. And that experience, I think, brought back the stories that my relatives and my family had told me. And it made me feel unsafe because it's sort of like I've heard the story before, right? I've heard what happens when armed militia enter a government building. I've heard what happens to the logical conclusion of that. And it felt to me like, America's always been this place where we're safe from that, where we don't have to worry about those things because our democracy, our government is while it is not perfect, and while we are, the United States government is responsible for massive atrocities of genocide, of slavery, of other things that we are absolutely, need to find ways to repair. In recent years, there has been a sense of, at least, we can, elect our leaders and democracy can happen. And comparatively to other countries across the world, things have been functioning okay. And we've been able to rely on a government that, that functions to some degree. And to have that experience was really a punch in the gut and made you feel like there was something else going on. And like I said, it brought back those stories of what it can be like to live in a country where things are really, really not good. So I think that's just what I wanted to share today, a little personal, story. And thank you again for having this this Zoom call.
Thank you so much, Representative Rabhi. And I can certainly relate that imagery, especially in the context now of our national politics and the things that our president is saying and the treatment of immigrants, so many things that you would not expect in 2020 America, to see machine guns in the state capitol, and what you just went through and experienced and described, it just in the state of the times. Yeah, it is a curious time, and thank you for sharing that. I can relate that personal experience and that imagery. I want to get Representative Donna Lasinksi in. I understand that she was at the Capitol also, and I want her to share with everyone on the call what she experienced. Are you there with us?
Yes, thank you. I've been here the whole time. I just wasn't visible the whole time. So thank you very much for asking me to come and share my experience today. Obviously echo everything that Senator Irwin, Jelani, and Representative Rabhi talked about the experience. And just like all of us, I'm sure we've been reflecting over the last couple of days about what that was and what happened. And I actually had a forum yesterday morning at about 9:30 a.m. And one of the comments made during the forum, and this forum was from a part of my district, a little bit west of here in Washtenaw County. It was in Dexter. It was a Dexter forum. And they regularly have about 50 people on it every other Saturday or so, just getting together, now via Zoom instead of in person. And one of the comments that was made was that, well, we understand there were guns there, but the folks that brought the guns, it was equal opportunity. They didn't care if you were a Democrat or a Republican. They didn't care, who you were. They were just there to intimidate. And I had to push back on that. I don't agree with that. I do absolutely believe that the men who came with guns, and they were men, and the white men who came with guns, and they were all white, absolutely did differentiate between a Democrat and a Republican, between a man and a woman, and between a person of color and a person who is not of color. I think they absolutely had the idea that they were going to try and convince folks who were different than them that their opinion on this current subject was the correct opinion. The only reason they brought guns there was to intimidate. And I will tell you, and I won't go too far in it, but I mean, I had a moment where I was very intimidated. Representative Rabhi and Senator Irwin and I shared an experience this past year at the Diag. Congresswoman Dingell had just left the Diag. We were there for a vigil, and there was the belief that there was an active shooting. The crowd ran, and I was trampled in the crowd. And there was a moment when I had to enter our House floor. And one of the points that Jelani made, he was trying to make sure that doors were unlocked. If we went up into the gallery, the back door was locked, and the only way we could exit was out through the protesters at the door. And so it was a moment where I was going to turn to go up those stairs, and I knew I would be locked in there. And I had a moment, and I simply could not proceed because the threat was that real to me, and I believe it was that real. What concerns me, 3 days later upon reflection, is how this pattern is emerging. And one of the first places we saw it was Charlottesville, where we're having the Second Amendment trump the First Amendment. And I use Trump in that comparison on purpose. When we see that, what we've heard is that at times law enforcement are reluctant to intercede when one of the groups coming purportedly to voice their opinion is armed heavily, they are much less likely to be arrested. The police are not intervening because by them using their Second Amendment right to open carry, which 45 states allow, they are intimidating the police from intervening on behalf of peaceful protesters. And so what you're seeing is we're going to have to come to this place where we determine whether or not free speech and quite frankly, peaceful free speech, free speech not accompanied by weapons or intimidation, is permitted in the public square. Because I believe when there were the videos and the images that our police were inhibited in reacting to clear acts of public disruption and inappropriate behavior and threatening behavior, because they knew, in the words of one of my colleagues, something could pop off at any moment. And I think that's a debate we need to start having. The same thing happened in Charlottesville. The police did not intervene until it was much too late because of the firepower that was brought to the public square.
Absolutely, and then when you put that in relation to law enforcement's relationship with people of color that are unarmed, and we see how that how that's played out, and
Absolutely.
then and within the white privilege argument, carrying carrying an automatic weapon and with impunity and intimidating people, and like you said, suppressing people's First Amendment and having that and suppressing or influencing law enforcement and intimidating them.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of that needs to be discussed further.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having this forum today. I appreciate it.
And thank you for your comments. I want to go to my rep, Ronnie Peterson, is on the line, and I apologize for having you come as at the end here. Certainly anxious to hear your comments. Mr. Peterson, are you there? Ronnie, do we have him, Annie?
I just unmuted him.
Okay.
Oops.
Representative Peterson? You know, we'll give him a few moments. Felicia, we've heard from a few people that were there that day. I think there was a range of thoughts there. Fear, certainly, I think, by the people there and actually people watching on TV. That's a common theme. If you want to speak to everyone's comments or just your thoughts on what you've heard so far, please do.
Sure. So thank you for having me, Alex. And I'm coming from the perspective of being a clinical psychologist and being able to work with folks in situations where there is trauma and fear and intimidation, and was asked to speak about what that means and what that can look like, and then particularly around that for people of color. So trauma is an event that occurs, and one of my colleagues describes it as this, as an event that overwhelms our coping strategies. One that happens that we then don't know what to do. Each of us experiences trauma in different ways, so each of us will respond to it, and it can look it can look differently for different people. And when a traumatic event happens, what generally happens is that our systematic or our sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and we go into that fight, flight, or freeze response. Representative Lasinksi talked about that freeze that can happen in that moment. Right before, she was talking about flight, like, how do I get out of here? Where are all of my options? And then some people can go into fight mode, and that is generally what happens for all of us. Like, in that moment, that adrenaline surge happens, and we can do one of those things. And it depends on the situation, and where we are, again, and how much access we have to our resources to be able to act in one of those three ways. So common responses to trauma include, and have been talked about by all of the panelists, fear or anxiety. Yousef or Jelani talked about feeling genuine fear and concern, and Yousef talked about feeling it was a scary experience. So that happens. Some people are in shock. You can shut down. And it can people can get angry and irritable. People can totally disconnect from the situation. Other people can start to withdraw and really kind of turn inside or internally. And then some people in some situations can start to feel guilt. And what happens usually when there is an event is that generally most of us experience it as an acute stress response. So something happens, we have a response to it, it's acute in that moment, and the accompanying emotions occur. And generally, we can work through that in about 3 to 6 weeks. As people, we can generally figure out what our response is, what happened, and start to integrate that into our psyche. But ways to help us as we're experiencing any amount of trauma is, really to slow down that sympathetic nervous system. And so I know that breathing can sound overrated, but it's really not. So we have more like neural pathways from our body to our brain than from our brain to our body. And so if we tell our body to slow down, then our brain has to start to do that too. And so that's why breathing and deep breathing helps us to kind of calm down. And it then allows us to have access to our frontal lobe so we can process and make decisions that can help us get in a safe place. So that's why those kinds of things are really important in those moments when we experience trauma, to really enact to help us. And Alex, I'm happy to also talk about kind of moving from specific individual trauma to, as people of color, experiencing trauma and continued trauma. And Yousef talked about it a little bit. If you'd like me to do that now, or I don't know if you want to talk with Representative Peterson.
Yeah, let me go to my producer, the esteemed Ypsi City Council person, Annie Somerville. Annie, do we have Representative Peterson on the line?
He is here and unmuted, and I think he started to try to talk a few seconds ago. Ronnie, are you there?
Well, since we're having some challenges with Representative Peterson's communication, we definitely will get him in. But Felicia, to circle back, the events, frightening as they were, impactful as they were at the Capitol, they weren't, not in a vacuum. There's a continuation, and I wanted Representative Irwin to give some of the background that led up to those events, or just the happenings, to kind of contextualize it for us, if you could.
No, thanks, Alex. One piece of context I thought was important to add is that, this isn't the first time there have been protests at the Capitol. And, for folks who know me, they know I like a good protest. And so, there have been a lot of protests at the Capitol over the years. And I wanted folks to get an idea of kind of where this fits in the context of that, both in terms of size and in terms of the way that the Capitol Police and the state police responded to the protest. Because I think that one of the things that really sparks concern in the minds of some folks, and certainly including myself, is that why was the response to this so much different than previous responses? And I come at it from the perspective not so much that I want the police response to be more aggressive in this situation, but more that I don't want the police response to be so aggressive every day in normal situations on the street, particularly with people of color, and I want instances of police brutality to stop. So, with that having been said, the protest on Thursday included, I think, around about 500 people. There were about 250 that got into the Capitol. The Capitol was not closed. They did have some restrictions around where people could go, but for the most part, the Capitol was open to these individuals. To put that in perspective, we had a protest last fall against auto no fault and the changes that were made to our car insurances that I think had about 5,000 people, maybe more. And the last very, very large protest I saw at the Capitol was in 2012, and during the lame duck in December, when Governor Snyder and the Republicans in the legislature changed our collective bargaining rules. A lot of times that was called right to work or right to work for less. When they passed that, there were about 20,000 people, maybe more, at the Capitol. And the response of the Republicans that run the Capitol now and ran the Capitol at that time was to actually close the Capitol completely. They closed it to the public completely. At that time, there were 8 arrests. At this time, I don't think there were any arrests. As far as I know, there were none. Now in 2012, even though there was way more people, orders of magnitude more people, as far as I know, there were no guns. The chair of the Washington Democratic Party was on the regular county party meeting yesterday and said that he didn't see any guns there. He was at that protest. I was once again inside. I can tell you that the noise inside the Capitol during that protest with 20,000 people was much greater than what we heard on Thursday with these folks who angrily visited with their firearms. The last time there was really some aggressive response activities in the Capitol was in 1999. At the time, the legislature and Governor Engler were taking over the Detroit schools. And there were a lot of concerns on behalf of Detroit parents whose kids were going to be attending those schools, who felt that it was unfair that the state was stepping in the way that they were, and they were making some of the decisions they were about their schools, and they wanted to have a voice in their schools. So they came to Lansing to speak out. And those protesters were met with metal detectors. So, back in 1999, the police and the leadership of the Capitol felt it was important to install metal detectors for those protesters. In this case, they took a much lighter hand. And so I think it's important to mention that, while, we've seen protesters get arrested at the Capitol before, we've seen protesters who are protesting against, pipelines get dragged away, in chains. The approach that we saw on Thursday was a much gentler approach. And I just, once again, I don't want more people to get arrested. To me, it just makes me want to reach out to my Republican colleagues and get them even more interested in the kind of legislation I'm introducing to reduce police brutality and to train police in why it is that they are so willing to arrest protesters when they're black and brown, but not when they're white.
And I thank you for that, for that work that you're doing and trying to convince those Republican lawmakers to join you in that. But just in this conversation, pointing out that was 500 protesters, and compared to the thousands that we've had for other protests in the Capitol. I mean, and particularly just how that looked for Michigan. People don't know those numbers and think that it might be more representative than it is. 500 people, significant it is with guns and why we're here, but relative to past protests, really small.
Throw a couple pictures at you, Alex?
Pardon me?
Let me throw a couple quick pictures at you, okay?
Okay, please do.
All right, so here is a quick one of, this was Thursday, from the Capitol steps. You can kind of see the size of the crowd, how sparse it was, how sparse it wasn't. Let's see if I can get this to come up. This is just one shot from, the right to work protest in 2012. You can get some sense of just kind of the difference in the magnitude of all these were loaded before. And these are some pictures that Ann Savage took on that day. And you can just see that the entire Capitol was filled with people at that time. So the protest was much larger, but nonetheless, there weren't the same efforts to show firearms and try to make a spectacle. The state didn't get embarrassed in the same way with Confederate flags and anti-Semitic imagery. It was a different sort of protest. And nonetheless, 8 people got arrested on that day.
Yeah, it shows the response. Thank you for that in the pics. Mr. Representative Peterson.
Yeah.
Do we have you?
You still don't hear me?
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear, and glad to hear that voice.
Oh, I've been listening to you ever since you started. I was on there before you even got started. So I've been listening to the conversation.
Well, I'm glad and apologize for the technical difficulties. I'm going to be quiet and welcome, and please tell us about what you experienced.
Well, let me just say, first of all, I appreciate you having this discussion, and certainly I'm enjoying the conversation that's already been taking place. I'm glad to hear the different perspectives and the different points of views. I think it's so important that we have these kind of conversations. Let me just say that I appreciate it because it's a generation that should hear it and see it. Less than 50-some years ago, this was an active, let me say, very active group. Maybe it was their grandfathers and their fathers, but it was a very active group. And it was not unusual for many of us who came up in the civil rights movement to be met on steps and doorways. Unfortunately, we were trying to get in, and they made sure we did not get in many situations, many times, and basically made sure the law enforcement was on their side. This was a different picture. I did go out to see the protesters from the House chamber to watch and see the discussion that taking place between them and, of course, our walls and our doors. And of course, confronting our law enforcement, which happened to be our sergeant at arms and some of the state police who was present there. But it was a sight that was unfortunate it had to occur. But it's important for us to remember our history. This was the scene. And many times we sometimes think it has passed. It was common 45 and 50, 60 years ago. It was very common. It was common in my ear. We must realize the fact that this will never go away. Unless good people stand up and good people engage in the process to make sure all of us included and no one is left out. But if some people want to include, let me say, disregard us as people and want to divide us as people and want to make sure they keep a wedge on American people can never get it together because they will intimidate and fear. And I think it's absolutely correct when someone said it was fear, to bring fear. It was not uncommon to travel to the South where everybody had a shotgun but you, particularly those of color. But they had shotgun racks. It was very common to have a shotgun rack in the back of your pickup truck. And many times those guns, let me say not many times, I've never seen a occasion when I talked to a fellow who had one that it wasn't loaded. It was loaded. It was loaded for a purpose, to intimidate. And basically let you know that the purpose and the role that shotgun hung in that back of that truck. It was important for Michigans to see this. Michiganders to see this, to know that this temperament, this kind of element exists in our state. It is important for us to stay engaged and stay involved. It's not going to go away. They may change uniforms. Next time they may come in suits and ties and basically pack underneath their coats. But it exists. And it exists for the fact that we must stay on alert and stay engaged and stay involved to change the political climate in our state and our nation. But this is part of the climate. There's a kind of climate that a certain element allows to exist and sometimes agitate and promote it for it to occur. And if you watch the news, it was not only in Michigan, it was across the country. And the only place they couldn't get them because they might have couldn't get enough to organize to be there because they come in groups. And the groups come because it's based on the stated point of being of intimidation, to bring about intimidation. So the larger the crowd, you hope you intimidate the legislative body or those individuals in those communities or those individuals who engage in it and, let me say, counteract what they do to make it look so negative about our people. And I say our people, because I think the majority of the people, they're not side with this kind of group. But we have to be the ones who are strong and those who believe that true democracy is inclusive of everyone, not a few that just carry guns. Unless we continue to speak up and speak out and be engaged, this kind of thing will become the norm, and we must cease it now. I just want to end with, I just want to stop there and allow you the opportunity to ask some questions or some of the other people you may have want to participate.
Okay, thank you, Representative Peterson, and thank you for those comments and reminding us this isn't new and how it existed in the past. And I guess it really makes me look at, I know it makes me wonder when people talk about, or so many of those supporters that say, make America great again, what are they talking about? I mean, I think those signs that those swastikas and those Confederate flags that we saw with those people that were holding those machine guns, you know, I think when they say make America great again, they're not thinking about the great parts of the past that they want to return to. And that's relating directly to race. And, you know, Dr. Brabec, Felicia, before we had Mr. Peterson come in, or and Representative Irwin contextualize things, you were going to kind of speak to the rekindling of fears, particularly to the African American community, people of color. So I'm going to let you in, and then we'll hear other questions and thoughts.
Thanks, Alex. I absolutely think that the use of guns is purposeful and a tactic that is been used for generations, and it's continuing to happen. And so one of the things that happens both for, I think, for people of color, but for people of color in particular, was one, when I was watching the protest, I was thinking, as you know, as a person of color, when I go to a protest, I think about safety. Like I think about like where its danger is going to be there. Where is it going to be? How's it going to be? Like, should our kids go or not? Will I be in danger? And I know that I'm not unique. This is common for other people of color. Wondering what's going to happen at a protest if we assert our constitutional right to and speak about whatever it is. And I'm struck by the ability for other folks, and folks in particular, to seemingly not have that process. And we know that happens because of the generational impacts of this. And Ronnie just spoke about that, and Yousef spoke about familial. And I feel like the generational trauma that happens too for us as people of color impacts our ability to make decisions, to voice opinions, and to do it in a safe way. And often that's not the case, and we're not allowed to do that. There's no room for that, or very little room for it. And so people try to figure out how to manage our own trauma around that, and to be able to voice opinions in ways so that we can be heard. And it takes, I think, conversations like this, where we're specifically talking about institutional and structural racism, and naming it as such, and naming the ability for some folks to protest in the way that they did without seemingly any consequence. And if it was Black and brown people, it might look very different, and it would look different, and why that is, and who's accountable to and for that. And I think that Jeff talked about legislation around police brutality and how important that is. And so I think that being able to have this conversation in a really honest and specific way, where we name what is going on, is really important, and actually helps then for people of color in terms of that generational trauma, to see that there may be a path forward.
So open and honest, really frank dialogue about it, and letting.
And then action.
And
figuring out what can we do, and if we can't do it, or who can, who can be allies, and then figuring out that plan of action to change what needs to be changed.
Thank you. Open dialogue, action, definitely. We have a lot of questions, and we've had our panelists speak, and I want to get everyone an opportunity that's watching, that we can give them the time limits, as many as we can. Annie, do you have a question for one of our panelists from some of our people that are on the webinar?
Yeah, so we started getting questions at the very beginning, so I'm going to do my best to combine some of them that are basically the same, and then I'm going to skip over ones that were already answered, just so we can get through all of these, if that's fine.
Okay.
So we're getting quite a bit just about, why weren't the protesters arrested? Why were there no legal repercussions? And essentially, why were they allowed to take guns inside the Capitol without any,
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just the host here, but I'd say our Second Amendment, but maybe, Jeff, maybe you could elaborate a bit on that, or does the Second Amendment cover it? That's why they were? Anything you want to add to that?
Well, you know me, I could add a lot, but I see Representative Lasinski is raising her hand, so let's let.
Representative Lasinski, please go ahead.
So in this specific case, our Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms, but it does not give us the right to bear arms everywhere. Michigan is one of only 2 states in the Union that allows the open carry of weapons inside the Capitol. So the architect of Michigan's Capitol actually built Texas's state capitol as well. And when I was down there just a couple months ago and went to visit the Capitol to see what the architect had done differently there, in Texas, I had to go through metal detectors to get into their Capitol. So it is uniquely Michigan, and I believe it's Wisconsin, is the only other state that permits the open carry of weapons into the Capitol.
So it seems there's an opportunity for change there in terms of protecting the Capitol, but open carry and outside of some selected spaces, we're pretty stuck with, aren't we? Unless there's a change in the Second Amendment.
We are. And when I was on the Ann Arbor Public School Board, we saw that battle come to the forefront when a gentleman felt he had to come locked and loaded to a high school choir concert. Now, we were able to put in place a policy that was later upheld by the Michigan State Supreme Court to give schools the right to have a policy that does not allow guns inside of public schools. But that is really the first and only change that's been made to our open carry and our places and spaces and keeping them safe in more than 20 years.
Thank you.
It's important to note too that the Capitol does not allow the carrying of signs into the Capitol. So you cannot bring a sign, but you can bring a gun. Pretty messed up.
I just want to add a quick story real quick, which is in, Representative Rabhi's Capitol office, we had a pride flag up. And the representative was admonished directly for having a pride flag up. But it is okay in a member's private office to have a gun. And that is something that some members do have in their personal offices.
My counterpart has a gun in his office, a scoped gun with an American flag painted on it. It's right above his conference table is a gun with the scope on it. And the first time I noticed it was right before the State of the State address that it was up there. So he can have that, but yeah. So Jelani's absolutely right.
Thank you. Annie, another question from some of our participants.
Sure. First, I just want to mention a few people have mentioned in the comments that their sound is not working. And unfortunately, I think that's happening on your end and I'm not able to fix that. And they might not be able to hear me say this, but I've been typing it as well. Okay, we've gotten a few other questions, just basically what can we do to stop this from happening again? Like placing requirements with regard to no Capitol protests with weapons, which we kind of already had some folks touch on. And then someone also brought up not being able to have signs. Let me go back to that one, sorry. As a water protector, one of our small groups was told that we had to remove our painter's stick by the Sergeant of Arms in the House office building in December of 2019. So that Yousef already kind of touched on that a little bit. But I think folks are just in general looking for what can be done to stop this from happening inside the Capitol again.
And I think Representative Lasinski touched on that.
So let me keep digging through these, sorry.
Okay.
If I could put a little bit of an emphasis on some of that conversation though too, some of the decisions on what happens within the Capitol building get to be made by the Capitol Commission, and some of the folks that are on the Capitol Commission, the appointments there, the leadership in both the House and the Senate get to control some of that, and so who is in charge in the House and the Senate has a direct impact on the rules in the Capitol building. And so quite frankly, Republicans will never change that rule. They are perfectly happy with guns being allowed in the Capitol. These are their people. And in fact, that brings me to something that I wanted to say earlier, which is Republicans were actually going out into the hallway to talk to and encourage the protesters that were out there. So that just goes to show you that, it is in many ways, not all Republicans supported the protest, but a number of them did. And it speaks to the fact that they support this type of action. They support these, political terrorists. They support people who are willing to be at a rally that was brandishing Confederate flags and Nazi symbology. It is unacceptable. And the only way to change this rule around whether guns will be allowed in the Capitol and whether signs will be allowed in the Capitol is to change who runs our state government. And unfortunately, we have Republicans in control of the House and the Senate. We need to change that. And we actually have an opportunity to do that in November.
Absolutely. And we have open absentee this year. We have an August primary coming up where we can get ready for November. I think everyone needs to make sure they're registered to vote. Tell your friends, get the word out. I think the events show in your statements, that the only way that we are going to change things is to have people engage and putting pressure on those office holders that are making those decisions. Annie, do you have another question?
Yeah, so that was kind of a good segue into one of the questions that someone had asked. Are any Republican senators or representatives condemning this behavior?
That is a great question. Does anyone want to? Jelani?
So, I am hesitant to speak before any of my, many bosses who are here on this panel. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But when Senator Zorn had the Confederate flag mask, which I actually saw in the parking garage, I almost texted you, Jeff, but I got busy with work and so I couldn't. The Senate leader, the Senate Republican leader, has been radio silent almost on that. But with the protests that we've seen this week, we have seen Speaker Chatfield, we have seen Leader Shirky come out and use very strong language related to the protesters and how that intimidation was wrong. But I can tell you that after these protests end and we've gotten past sort of this political moment, that intimidation doesn't end, as Representative Rabhi and I have alluded to. The intimidation doesn't stop because we still have to go into offices where there are guns, where there are MAGA hats, and have meetings and discussions on how to get the business of the House done. And these are places where, that can't be avoided. I'm a staffer who's in a unique position where, come hell or high water, I'm going to be on the floor to try to make sure that the business of the House can be done, and it doesn't matter what's going on. And so this intimidation just won't necessarily end because of the strong language that has been used, because if they were really serious about it, they would actually direct their members on the Capitol Commission to make a change so that firearms wouldn't be allowed in the Capitol, would not be allowed in member offices. But that wouldn't behoove them because they've got a subset of voters who are going to insist over hell or high water that they are able to have and walk through the Capitol with firearms and, to use Representative Lasinski's words, trump our First Amendment rights.
Thank you. That's frustrating.
Jelani covered that really well, but one thing I do want to add is that in the Senate, in the wake of Senator Zorn wearing that Confederate logo and then giving a sort of ham-handed half apology, if you want to give it that much credit, a number of my colleagues have spoken up and asked for some sort of action in the Senate, including myself. And you could certainly very easily find very passionate speeches from Senator Santana and from Senator Geis, asking for some sort of action, for the Republican leader to speak out against Senator Zorn. And so, while I will give Senator Shirky, the Senate Majority Leader, some credit for calling the protesters jackasses, which is what he called them in the media, for sort of, kind of going on the muscle with their firearms. He hasn't said anything, as far as I know, about what Senator Zorn did, other than to point to Senator Zorn's apology. And Senator Bullock, who's the chair of the Michigan Black Caucus, stood up during Senate chamber during session this week and gave a very impassioned speech about, what it means to respect one's colleagues. And so, I think that the response to what is really at the core of what's so wrong and terrible about what these protesters were pushing, really hasn't come clear, right? There has been some response to the firearms, but the firearms are really, something there that's just a part of it. It's just in many ways, to me, it's a distraction from what is sort of the core of the evil, which is the racism.
And if I could,
we did a letter from the House side to Speaker Chatfield after the first incident, not asking him to call out the guns that were there, quite frankly, but exactly what you were getting at there, Jeff, was to asking him to call out the racism, asking him to call out the anti-Semitic symbols that were there. And quite frankly, it's been radio silent. And that letter's now been released to the public with everyone from our caucus who signed it. I think giving them the excuse of only speaking to the guns that physical manifestation of kind of that aggressive posturing is too easy. Quite frankly, it's too easy to let them off the hook, to only push back on that one aspect or speak up on that one aspect. And I think they think that covers it, and it doesn't.
And if I could add to that too, it was one of the observations that I made pretty early on in the protest was there was a lot of American flags at the protest. And I think part of the reason for that is because the Republicans had gotten pretty beat up for the Operation Gridlock that they had done, where there was the sea of Confederate flags and all the Nazi symbology and all that. And you could almost tell that they had made, it almost felt like a conscious attempt to reduce the amount of symbology that was there. And it was, everybody had an American flag. They were wearing like red, white, and blue shirts and everything. They were singing, the national anthem. They were trying to be all patriotic. But even with all their efforts, there were still Confederate flags there that popped up every once in a while. There was this guy that was pacing around the Capitol with a flag that was half the American flag, half the Confederate flag. Things like that. The racism seeped in. There was at one point, a girl dancing with a mask. I think it was either an Obama mask or it was, blackface of some kind. And she was dancing to, wearing patriotic colors with this mask on. And I think that really speaks to the fact that they are trying to, and they will continue to try to cover their racism with red, white, and blue paint, and make it seem like it's something different. And so even though Chatfield and Shirky were willing to come out and say, hey, these protesters were jackasses, well, and in some ways the symbology with the senator that wore the Confederate mask, it's like he could be wearing an American flag mask, but the fact is the words that are coming out of his mouth and the bills that he's voting on and the things that he's doing are still helping the system of racism that is, putting Black and brown lives in jeopardy. And so, this is about the bigger conversation. This is about the fight that we have ahead of us of transforming American society and making sure that these are just outward displays of racism. This is the visible manifestation of something that seeps throughout our society. And whether it's the fact that, kids in Ann Arbor public schools have different opportunities than kids in Ypsi public schools, whether it's the fact that Latina and Latino members of our Washtenaw County community have a much lower life expectancy than white, citizens in our community. These are the things that exist in our daily society that aren't shown in such a brazen way. But these types of moments remind us that they exist. And no matter how the Republicans try to paint over this, it's like putting sprinkles on a pile of crap. You can't paint over it enough, because we need to be able to see through that red, white, and blue that they try to paint over everything and call it out for what it is. Because it will keep coming back. They will keep coming back, and this is not going to stop. I can see this just continuing on.
Absolutely, and I think the protests were at least what they were saying. It was in response to Governor Whitmer's reasoned, facts, science-based, reasonable methods to keep us safe, and to protect us. And what doesn't get lost in me in those racist flags and symbolism is, if they had their way, the people that would be most in danger are people of color, are people on the front lines. Those are, we have a new redefinition of essential workers. We're seeing those people that are out and taking the brunt of this COVID are disproportionately African American, disproportionately working class, the people that don't have the privilege of being able to work at home and have to be out there exposed. And our governor's trying to protect them. And you can see just with the protesters how willing they are to choose profits over people, or choose some like twisted version of personal freedom over the protection of the public, and not considering people of color are the most vulnerable. So, they're not looking out for us. I want to get to some more questions. Annie, give some
Yeah,
other.
actually, Congresswoman Dingell just, she's here again, so I'm going to give her a minute to talk if she would like to.
My internet went down, and then
Okay.
I'm not as talented as the other faces here, but I got to meet back up. So I'll just listen and then add.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So we're getting just some other questions, kind of just on the same point of, you know, why weren't folks arrested? They were clearly, there were nooses. They were representing, you know, images of known terrorist organizations. So I think folks are just really trying to break down that some more. If someone wants to take that on any further.
Well, I guess one story that I'll just share too from the Capitol that may, I don't know that it necessarily answers that, because I don't know that any of us can answer that, because, you know, we're not the police, but I can definitely say that, you know, some of the things that we've talked about already in this webinar of the differential treatment that you see between different groups of protesters, you know, that's very real. And the fact that, you know, if the protesters had been Black or brown, if they had been, you know, Native American, if they had been, you know, any other race, essentially, I think the response would have been very different. And one of the stories I just wanted to share is, you know, when the protests started heating up, initially it was just the sergeants at arms, the folks in the red coats that had run to the door to try and put their bodies basically in between the protesters and the door. And so, you know, but eventually the state police came down. But when the state police came down, they didn't have any type of, you know, face shields. They didn't have any type of, you know, they were just in their normal, you know, Michigan State Police, you know, attire, and they had like the surgical masks to protect against coronavirus, which I don't, you know, I mean, none of the protesters had masks on. And in fact, when I went out, I described this to my aunt, who's a teacher, as like when you're in a classroom on a June, you know, a warm June day, and the classroom smells all funky, you know, it smells like breath, it smells like BO, it smells like all different stuff. That's what the hallway smelled like when the door opened really briefly when I was in the back of the room. And so I don't know, I mean, there was, it was a bad situation from a public health standpoint, but the officers themselves were not, they didn't have riot gear on, they didn't have any type of protection, again, beyond just their normal attire and that surgical mask. And it wasn't until later on in the day, as I was leaving the building, that I actually noticed that there was a unit of Michigan State Police that were waiting in one of the offices. And this unit of Michigan State Police was in more tactical gear. They had their combat boots, they had their bulletproof vests, they had bigger guns, but they weren't coming out, they weren't visible, they were just in one of the side rooms sort of waiting. And again, that's very different from what you would see at, you know, for example, the protest in 2012 that Jeff was describing, the right to work protest, you know, where those folks were, you know, out, they had their riot gear out, they were, you know, macing people. That was the response then versus the response now. And again, it's directly attributable. I mean, I don't think there's any way, I don't think that there is any way of saying otherwise. It is directly attributable to the fact that these were white people that came in brandishing weapons. Again, if it was people of any other race, this would have been a different response. People would have probably been arrested or gotten injured or even died from, you know, the law enforcement officer's response. I have no doubt in my mind. This was completely an instance of white privilege when it comes to how the protesters were treated within the Capitol.
I completely agree with you, and thank you for pointing that out. Someone else?
Someone actually asked if the other panelists would touch on the point that Yousef just made. So I don't know if anyone just wants to jump in or maybe raise your hand and I can unmute you for the panelists.
It's Debbie. I am gonna make a comment that I think there's a difference in administration as well, that this governor is being attacked for trying to save lives. And this has become a very political situation at a time that it shouldn't. Right to work was very political, but those that were in control didn't believe in the right to work, didn't believe in freedom of speech, freedom to protest, and that Democrats are trying to weigh that. I agree on part of what you said, Yousef, that if they had been a different color, but I also think that this administration is trying to respect people's right of free speech and to protest. And I think that what happened on Thursday scared a lot of people who are trying to respect people's rights. And also, a Republican governor would never have tolerated that. They wouldn't have given people even that little leeway, if you want to know the truth. Even though these were, I'm trying not to be political in these times, but it's very hard not to be political. But I also think people on this discussion are trying to protect people's rights, and nobody gave a damn about people's rights back then.
Thank you, Congresswoman Dingell. Annie, I think, didn't we have a question for Jelani, didn't we? Someone, you sort of.
Annie, while you're talking, or while you're looking, I just wanted to comment on that too. I think the other thing that is very different with these protests is that the president has spoken in support of the governor trying to make a deal with the protesters. And I think that the permission slip for the acts of clear and blatant acts of, to me, of racism and using that as tactics of intimidation and fear, I think that just continues to spur that on. And so there, folks are getting, these horrible actions are being celebrated and lifted up by the president, which I think encourages that to happen more, which means that these conversations and then subsequent actions and trying to hold that at bay is even more important.
Absolutely. Jeff, did you have a comment or something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, if all the panelists were going to weigh in on this question of, would it have been different if the protesters, looked differently, if the protesters were people of color? I was just going to go back to some of the content that I was talking about earlier, which is that we know that, in fact, the response is different when the people look different. We saw that in 2012. We also saw it particularly in 1999. So if we look at the history of what's happened in the Capitol and the response of the Capitol Police, it has been different when people of color have protested. And so not only have we seen it different there in the Capitol, but we've seen it at other places in the state. Recently when people were protesting the installation of pipelines, there were people dragged away in chains and arrested and called eco-terrorists. But despite the fact that these individuals seem to be engaging in a much more intimidating posture, the response seemed to be much more kid gloves.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Thank you. I want to get a couple more questions, and then we're going to close out at 7:30. I'm going to, after a couple questions, give Representative Peterson a chance to start off by giving just some closing comments, and I'll give all the other panelists, and I'll let Felicia wrap up. But first, Annie, are there a couple questions that are standing out that before we give the panelists a chance to close out that you definitely want to get to?
Sure, yeah. So one of them is just asking who makes the call, and this is an old one. I think this kind of got covered by Yousef earlier. Who makes the call on the level of police in the response? Is it just the state police? And then there was another question similar to that. So I don't know, I feel like that got answered, but if someone wants to include any more information on that, that might be helpful to answer that question.
The quick answer is that a lot of the police response is, and the level of presence is dictated by the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader in the Senate. So that's the short answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
And then there's another question just calling out that we need to talk about racism and sexism in the media, and they're just asking if there's any media here. I think there are members of the media here. Someone had asked for the lineup, and I gave that to them, so I'm not sure where they're from, but at least one person from the media is on this call. Another person's asking, can we identify the right-wing protesters from the photos? I'm not sure who wants to answer that, if that's something that we can answer.
Well, that makes me think of a question. I mean, are there any, someone asked earlier, are there any Republican leaders that have condemned the protest or those? I'm wondering, are there any that have openly supported, like the president has, or encouraged or given the nod and the wink? Some people that we should keep our eye on. Yeah.
I think we need to be very frank that when there was the first protest a week ago, that the Speaker of the House, Lee Chatfield, leaned out his office window and along with another person who he had employed there and waved an enormous American flags out the window. In fact, it's now one of his pinned pictures on his Twitter account. And straight across from his window, straight across from his windows at the Capitol is the statue of our Confederate War governor who sent troops from Michigan to fight for the end of slavery. And in front of that were protesters waving the Confederate flag. And so there have been, I can offer him the grace that in that moment, he didn't see the flags as he was waving the American flag directly across at them. I can offer him that grace, but when told that that is what had occurred, he has made no statement to say that wasn't appropriate. So yes, there's direct encouragement of these protests from Republican leaders. And so for them to be surprised or for them to only want to make a statement about the presence of guns and that portion of it escalating, to me simply is unacceptable. And we have spoken as a group and we have spoken as individuals with the speaker, but it doesn't, at this point, it has not yielded any type of public action.
Okay. Thank you. That's Representative Lasinski, correct?
Yes, Donna.
Sorry, Donna, thank you.
There's a few other questions. Oh, sorry.
No, yeah, please go ahead.
There's a few questions that are unrelated to, they're related to COVID and some of the executive orders, but they're not related to this discussion. So I would just ask people, if you have questions that are just general COVID and executive order, just questions like that, you can email all of our offices and we'll try to get those answered for you.
Okay.
So can I acknowledge a comment that just came through? I'm wondering if it's from my colleague. She has the same name as a colleague. I did want to say, outside of the guns, but there was an escalation in the racist and anti-Semitic motifs that were there. I mean, there were nooses, there were gallows and nooses on site. There were flags, there were phrases and sayings on signs. It was a clear escalation. And one of the most heartbreaking things that for me, because it's not my lived experience to be a person of color, was when one of my colleagues put on a group chat we had, is it safe for us to come to work? And I don't think she was talking about being worried about me coming to work. And so to feel very deeply that my colleague, as they were looking and hearing about what was happening at the Capitol on their drive to work. There were guns last time, there were guns this time, but the escalation in the racist rhetoric gave me in that moment a very clear view into the deep and heartfelt fear that she had that was very different than mine because of my different lived experience.
I do want to jump on that because I had some of those experiences, but on the staff end. So while session's going on, while I'm trying to organize members, while I'm also trying to figure out how the members are getting out, I'm also getting text messages from staffers, from members, and they're asking me questions like, can my boss leave? Can we get her a police escort? I had members asking me, can I leave? Should I leave? Mm-hmm. And you know, and for me that's a hard call to make, because how am I supposed to tell somebody who's a representative that I need them there to vote, but also I have to worry about their bodily harm as well. And you know, the members that were there were courageous and they made it through it. But it didn't change the fact that the things that some of them weren't seeing were their staff experiencing this and watching this in different ways and trying to synthesize this and trying to figure out how they could support their bosses in a way that frankly they physically weren't able to. And the other piece I will say to this, at least for me, is, you know, when I was in school, because I went to school, a lot of different schools, but in two places, particularly in Michigan, in Livingston County and in Monroe, you know, I went to school with kids who periodically had, you know, the trader's apron on their car or on a belt buckle. And then I continue to see it now in my work life. And what I'm reminded is, one, I don't know if I'll ever be welcome fully in a public place. And the second, I don't know at any point in my work life where it is not going to be a hazard for me to go to work. And I don't just think about the protests, like I said earlier, I think about all those other days where myself, you know, the floor leader, Rabhi, have to deal with that kind of intimidation. But, you know, for me, that gives me a little pause and a little grace is, you know, we do have good people in the State House. We do have good people on our side who are pushing back against this. It's just that this past week they had to exercise more courage than they needed to.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jelani, for that. And, you know, I'm going to shift gears a bit because I want to respect the time. And Miss Gail Summerhill of Ypsi Can I Share is responsible for all of us being here and the opportunity to hear from the panelists and for all of us to process everything that happened. So I definitely want to give a shout out to her and acknowledge and thank her for doing this. In her thoughts and around this, she really wanted to address the fear that was felt from the people that were there and just what it rekindled and people that were watching. And that's why we have Dr. Brabec here to help us with that. And I know that she has some thoughts prior to and just from what she's heard here. So I'm gonna let her, you know, give her thoughts, and I'll give any panelists a chance to say goodbye before we close out after her. So Dr. Brabec, Felicia, please,
Thanks,
you have the
Alex.
floor. You're welcome.
So I think it's really important to continue to remember, and Jelani just touched on this too, that the trauma that continues to happen is very real, and it comes out for those of us who are people of color in very real ways. So that there are moments where, and often many, where we're afraid to enter spaces, whether that's work or a protest. It can be social spaces because of the color of our skin, and then the assumptions made about us because of that, and seen as both other or dangerous, and the continual perpetration of that, again, like I was saying, from the president, is, to me, again, as a person of color, is exceedingly worrisome and dangerous, and it puts people's lives in danger. That the racism continues to be perpetuated, puts people's lives in danger, and that's, I feel like, what has continued to happen with these protests. And for the people of color who are at the Capitol, those are very real life and death decisions that should not be taken for granted or taken lightly, that have to be made every day.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Representative Peterson, do you want to lead off and saying goodbye or concluding or giving your thoughts? Having some challenges there. I'll just, anybody raise your hand of our panelists if you'd like to jump in before we take off and close out. Annie, do we have anyone else? I know, you know, 'cause I'm gonna just say some closing comments, but I know we have a lot of people that have thoughts, and I don't
Yeah,
want
I
to.
just followed up in the comments to let folks know if they didn't get theirs answered. There were a number of questions that weren't related to the discussion, so I wanted to keep it focused on what we were talking about.
Okay, Jeff.
Oh, sorry.
Alex, I just want to very briefly thank you and the organizers who put this together, and thank Annie for moderating and my colleagues for being on here. And, you know, it's always important that we talk about the impact that racism has on policy here in Michigan. It colors so much of what we do. We live in one of the most segregated states in the union, and we see it all the time. And, you know, I really wish that we were focusing on, and maybe we need to have another panel to focus on how that, racism and how the inequalities have affected people with respect to this pandemic, and how this pandemic is hitting different communities in different ways. But instead, because of the outrageous, in-your-face kind of level of racism we saw at the Capitol, we have to be talking about that as well, and letting folks know is happening there. So I just really appreciate the opportunity, and for folks, giving us a chance to let folks know what's happening in the Capitol.
Hey, thank you, and thank you for sharing your experience and your comments and those words. Anyone else next on our panel?
Just thank you
Jelani,
for inviting me into the conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to share experiences.
Thank you. Was that Donna or?
That was Donna.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna.
I do want to quickly close out, but say something slightly off topic, only to the extent that, Representatives Warren, Peterson, Lasinksi, Senator Irwin, and then my colleagues in my office, Alexi and Aaron, all of their staffs who have been working through this crisis have been phenomenal. There are people who, these staffers across all of these offices are hidden heroes, pushing through some of these cases. And so although we're having this discussion, to my colleagues on the staff side, I just hope that we remember them as they're pushing through other challenges that were not discussed in this particular discussion, because they've been doing phenomenal work. And I want to make sure that that was heard.
Thank you. And
I want to add something, actually. Gail Summerhill, actually, I just want to thank her. And she actually called me the other day to make sure that I was okay. I've been working from home for almost 2 months now, but when I saw the picture that Senator Polhanke had posted with the men with rifles in the Senate gallery, I was a little shaken up about that. And I was trying to work on constituent cases, but it was a little difficult. So Jelani brought up a really good point, and I really appreciate Gail taking the time out to call me and make sure that I was okay. Even though I wasn't in Lansing, it was still a pretty scary day for, I think, a lot of us.
Yes. Yes. I want to thank Gail too, also for asking me to host and give me this opportunity to do the best I can in getting everyone's voice in. And I think, was that Yousef? Did you have?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like to try to end panels with some action items too for people. I think that, obviously this was a fantastic conversation, and I want to thank you for putting it together. Some of the action items I think that I want to talk about. One is emphasizing what was just said around the staffers. If you have the time to just email our offices with a thank you note for the staffers that are working hard. They're processing unemployment cases. They're trying to help people to get through the system. And obviously, they're on the front lines of this crisis in many ways. And so if you have the time to contact them and just say thank you, I think that would be fantastic. The other thing is, I think folks should contact the Capitol Commission and push for guns to be banned in the Capitol. It's about whether or not our government is going to be able to function. I think that's the bottom line with all of this, is we want to live in a democracy where our government can function. So contact the Capitol Commission. And then the third thing is to contact family members of yours. This is a time when we're all, really in close quarters. We can't leave our houses to do very much. And so take this opportunity to call family members, to call friends that you may not have talked to in a long time, who may have different political views than you, and have these conversations with them. Have a conversation, and you may find that this is an opportunity to rekindle those connections, and you may find that it's an opportunity to open some doors that you previously thought were closed, because this is how we're going to start to move the needle on some of this stuff. It was a scary experience, as we talked about on the floor, to have those political terrorists there, to be saying the things that they were saying. Watching the videos of it afterwards and some of the things that were being said by those individuals, it reminded me really of the mindset that a lot of these people are in, which is that they believe that their lives are the most important. And frankly, it felt like that Black and brown lives, that people of color, their lives were expendable. And the way that they were talking and the way that they were verbalizing their anger, that is what it felt like. And we cannot allow for individuals like that to have the bullhorn. We cannot allow for people like that to steal the headlines. We have got to organize as a society around a different message. And I absolutely echo what Representative Peterson said. I think he said it really well. This is our current iteration of generations and decades and centuries of slavery, of oppression, of genocide, of Jim Crow, of frankly, an America that does not live up to the Constitution, to the lofty goals and ideals that we have as a country, and we can do better. We have to do better, and that's on all of us to organize, to push, to call it out when we see it, and to stand up strong for our democracy and for a better future for all of us. So thanks you again for having this panel.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I think that's a great summation. And we have to vote. We have to make sure that we're registered. We have to make sure that we actually vote and get out there and tell others to. So I don't want to keep anyone any longer. We're over. Thank you all to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone that did call in, and thank you for your questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Brabec, for contextualizing us and giving us some tips on how to deal with what we all experience and process that all. That is it. Make sure you all vote. Thank you for tuning in. We're all in this together. We're all our brothers' keepers. Much love to everybody. Bye-bye.